Before we get into this, one honest note. This isn't a story about slavery being secretly pleasant. It was a violent, dehumanizing system, and nothing in this video changes that. But historians have actually found real evidence: graffiti, legal records, festival calendars, gaming boards carved directly into stone steps, showing that enslaved people in ancient Rome still built moments of joy, community, and even rebellion inside a system designed to deny them all three. Understanding how they did that tells you something important about how people survive, even under conditions built specifically to break them. So, let's look at what the evidence actually shows. This question matters for a reason beyond simple curiosity, too. For a long time, popular history treated enslaved people almost entirely as background labor, bodies that built roads and harvested crops, mentioned only in passing, with no interior life of their own worth reconstructing. The archaeological and literary record actually pushes back hard against that framing. Tavern graffiti, legal contracts, funeral inscriptions, and even trash-talking messages carved into gaming tables all point toward real people with real social lives, real friendships, real hopes for the future, operating underneath an official Roman record that mostly only cared about them as property. Reconstructing their leisure time is really a way of reconstructing their humanity, using whatever fragments survived. Before we go further, it's worth being upfront about where this evidence actually comes from, because it shapes everything else in this video. At its peak, roughly 40% of the population of the city of Rome may have been enslaved, and the experience of that population varied enormously depending on the work you were forced into. Skeletal remains recovered from Pompeii tell a brutal, unambiguous story for a huge share of that population. Work gangs found still chained together in death exactly as they lived. Chronic arthritis and bone deformities consistent only with extreme sustained overwork and malnutrition. Almost everything we're about to cover, festivals, gambling, savings accounts, social clubs, comes disproportionately from urban, domestic, and skilled slaves. The people most likely to leave behind graffiti, business records, or a name carved into a gravestone. Agricultural and mining slaves, who made up a huge share of the enslaved population, left almost no written trace of their daily lives at all. And what little physical evidence survives points toward conditions that were significantly harsher. Keep that imbalance in mind as we go. This is a real, well-documented picture of Roman slavery, but it's not the whole picture, and it was never evenly distributed. If you want the single most dramatic piece of evidence that Roman slaves had an inner life the system tried to suppress, it's a festival called Saturnalia, held every December in honor of Saturn, the god of agriculture and, fittingly, liberation. For 1 week, from December 17th through the 23rd, huge portions of ordinary Roman social order were deliberately, temporarily suspended. During Saturnalia, enslaved people were, by widespread custom, served at the dinner table by their own masters. They wore the pallius, the same soft felt cap normally reserved for freedmen, marking a symbolic taste of the legal freedom most of them would never actually receive. Gambling and dice games, strictly illegal for the rest of the year, became not just permitted, but a central part of the celebration. Households would elect a king of Saturnalia by dice roll, whose ridiculous commands everyone, including the actual head of the household, had to follow for the day. Ancient sources describe masters and slaves eating side by side, trading jokes across a class boundary that was otherwise rigid and frequently violently enforced. It's worth being clear-eyed about what this actually was and wasn't. Saturnalia wasn't abolition, even temporarily. Some Roman sources describe masters who resented the tradition and negotiated it down to something closer to eating together rather than genuinely serving, worried about what a full role reversal might invite. And the moment the festival ended, every single one of those temporary privileges vanished, and the ordinary machinery of ownership, punishment, and forced labor resumed exactly where it left off. But the fact that Roman society built an entire annual ritual specifically around inverting the master-slave relationship tells you that even the people running the system understood, on some level, that the hierarchy needed periodic, controlled venting to keep functioning at all. Saturnalia wasn't the only moment on the Roman calendar built around this idea either. The Compitalia, a festival held at neighborhood crossroads shrines dedicated to household guardian spirits called the Lares, specifically included enslaved people in its celebrations, with some sources suggesting the festival originated partly as a holiday for slaves in particular, offering a rare day where labor stopped and shared communal celebration took its place. Between Saturnalia and Compitalia, an enslaved Roman's calendar year wasn't a single unbroken stretch of labor. It had genuine, recurring, socially sanctioned breaks built directly into it, however temporary and however carefully controlled by the same people who owned them the rest of the year. Away from the one sanctioned week of chaos, enslaved and formerly enslaved Romans built an enormous, sustained culture around gambling and games, much of it technically illegal and pursued anyway. Archaeologists have found gaming boards for Ludus Latrunculorum, literally the game of little soldiers, a strategy game roughly comparable to checkers, carved directly into stone steps and pavements across the Roman world, including areas with heavy slave and lower-class foot traffic, suggesting these were played casually, in public, whenever a spare moment appeared. Taverns played a huge role here too. One recovered tavern sign near a Roman military camp advertised in so many words, "Good food and gambling within." A separate gaming table has survived bearing an inscription that translates roughly to "Make room for better players," a genuine piece of trash talk preserved in stone from 2,000 years ago. Dice games specifically were popular enough and illegal enough outside of Saturnalia that loaded dice have been recovered by archaeologists, evidence of Romans across every social class trying to cheat each other out of money, in exactly the way you'd expect from any underground gambling scene in any century. Access to taverns and this kind of leisure time depended heavily on what type of enslaved person you were. Urban domestic slaves and skilled workers, especially those trusted enough to run errands or conduct business on a master's behalf, had meaningfully more freedom of movement through a city than agricultural slaves working under direct, constant supervision. That freedom of movement is exactly why they're the ones who show up in tavern graffiti and gaming records at all. The evidence follows the people who actually had a chance to leave one. Here's one of the strangest, most specific features of Roman slavery, and it shaped an enormous amount of what leisure and hope actually looked like for many enslaved people: the peculium. Masters frequently allowed slaves, particularly skilled or urban ones, to manage a personal fund, money earned through side work, gifts, or a cut of business dealings conducted on the master's behalf. Legally speaking, the peculium still technically belonged to the master. In practice, it functioned as something close to personal property, and slaves could spend it, invest it, or save it. Some slaves, remarkably, even used their peculium to acquire what Roman law called a vicarius, essentially a slave owned by another slave. A genuinely strange feature of the legal system that only makes sense once you understand how thoroughly the peculium blurred the line between property and person. But the real weight of the peculium sat in a single, life-altering possibility: buying your own freedom. Manumission, the formal act of freeing a slave, was significantly more common in Rome than in many other slave-holding societies throughout history, and a substantial share of manumissions were actually purchased by the enslaved person themselves using peculium they'd saved specifically for that purpose, sometimes over years or decades. This changes how you have to think about fun and leisure time for a meaningful share of Rome's enslaved population. A tavern visit, a dice game, a small luxury bought with spare coin existed alongside a much longer, much more serious project running quietly in the background, accumulating enough money to eventually walk away a free person. Every coin spent on entertainment was, for many, a coin not saved toward that goal, which means the leisure we can document was frequently a deliberate, hard-won choice, not just idle time with nothing better to do. Manumission itself wasn't guaranteed even once the money was saved. Historians studying the practice note that a slave could only realistically buy their own freedom once their accumulated peculium exceeded their own market value to the master, meaning the goalpost itself was set by the very person profiting from keeping it just out of reach. Some masters freed elderly slaves specifically once they'd become too old to be economically useful, less an act of mercy than a way of shedding an expense. Others reportedly offered freedom as a reward for military service during civil unrest, or to prevent a slave from testifying against them under the threat of torture, which was itself standard, legally sanctioned practice for extracting testimony from enslaved witnesses in Roman courts. Even the hope of freedom, in other words, operated inside a system engineered first and foremost around what benefited the owner. Roman law didn't recognize marriage between enslaved people, a relationship between two slaves, however committed, however long-lasting, had a specific legal term, contubernium, that explicitly withheld the rights and protections of actual marriage, precisely because either partner or any children born from the relationship could legally be sold away at any moment, regardless of how the family itself felt about it. This wasn't a minor technicality. It was one of the most brutal, ever-present realities of enslaved life in Rome, and no festival or savings account changed that underlying vulnerability. Partly in response to that precariousness, enslaved and formerly enslaved Romans built their own institutions to create the stability the law refused to grant them. Collegia Funeraticia, funerary associations, allowed even the poorest members of Roman society, slaves included, to pay small regular contributions into a shared fund that guaranteed a proper funeral and burial rites when the time came, along with regular shared meals and social gatherings in the meantime. For someone with no legal family and no guaranteed protection from being sold away from the people they loved, a collegium offered something close to a chosen family, a stable, recurring community that existed specifically because the formal legal system refused to provide one. Certain religious cults, especially the cult of Isis, drew heavily from exactly this population, offering enslaved and freed people a genuine sense of belonging and status inside a religious community that didn't care about their legal status the way Roman civic life did. Even something as small as being allowed to wear a toga at a collegium funeral, a garment technically reserved for freeborn citizens, mattered enormously to people who, as one Roman satirist bitterly noted, might only ever get to wear one at their own funeral. Put all of this together, and a genuinely complicated picture emerges, one that resists a clean, comfortable conclusion in either direction. Enslaved Romans gambled illegally in taverns, celebrated a week each December, where the entire social order briefly inverted, saved money for years toward the specific life-changing goal of buying their own freedom, and built funeral clubs and religious communities that functioned as substitute families in a legal system that denied them real ones. None of that happened because Roman slavery was secretly gentle. It happened because human beings placed inside almost any system of control will still carve out whatever fragments of dignity, connection, and joy the cracks in that system allow. And the Romans, running one of the most thoroughly documented slave societies in history, happened to leave behind an unusually detailed record of exactly where those cracks were. It's also worth sitting, one more time, with the imbalance running underneath all of it. The tavern graffiti, the gaming boards, the peculium accounts, and the funeral clubs mostly survive because urban and skilled slaves had just enough autonomy to leave a trace behind. The people chained together in a Pompeian work gang, the agricultural laborers who left no graffiti and no gaming boards because they never had the freedom of movement to visit a tavern in the first place, are largely silent in this record. Not because their lives held no moments of connection or resistance, but because the same system that denied them freedom also denied most of them the chance to be remembered at all. That silence is, in its own way, as important as everything else in this video. Historians reconstructing the past can only work with what physically survives, and what survives is never evenly distributed across a society. It tends to survive in exact proportion to who had a little bit of freedom, a little bit of money, or a little bit of literacy to leave something behind. The joyful, well-documented fragments of Roman slave life you've just heard about are real, and they matter. But they represent the version of slavery that came with just enough breathing room to be recorded, and the far larger, far harsher version of that same system left behind mostly silence, chains, and bones bent from decades of forced labor no festival ever interrupted. If this changed how you think about Roman history, let us know in the comments which detail surprised you most: the peculium, Saturnalia, or the funeral clubs. And subscribe for more of history's most overlooked, most human details, reconstructed straight from the evidence.